The morning heat rose in shimmering waves across the airfield at Charters Towers, Queensland. In 1942, mechanics moved slowly under the blazing Australian sun, their hands slick with oil and exhaustion, unaware that inside a small tin hangar, history was being rewritten. Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a 43-year-old former Navy pilot with grease-stained fingers and a restless fire in his eyes, leaned over the nose of a battered bomber. The aircraft before him looked like any other: dented aluminum, twin engines, a familiar silhouette among the hundreds scattered across Allied bases. But this B-25 was different. To most, it was a medium bomber meant to drop bombs from high above the jungle canopy. To Pappy Gunn, it was raw potential, an unrefined beast waiting to be awakened. In a few hours, his makeshift modifications would be tested in combat. If they worked, Allied forces would finally have a weapon capable of ripping Japanese convoys to pieces. If they failed, men would die, and Gunn would be remembered as the madman who ruined a perfectly good bomber chasing an impossible dream. Yet failure was the last thing on his mind. His wife and 4 children were prisoners in Manila, starving behind the wire of a Japanese internment camp 1,700 miles away. Every turn of his wrench, every rivet and welded plate was driven by something deeper than duty. It was rage, fear, and love, all melted into one. He wasn't building an aircraft. He was building a way to reach them, a weapon forged from desperation. What emerged from that hangar would defy design manuals, shock the engineers who built the plane, and terrify the enemy it hunted. This wasn't a story of advanced technology or factory precision. It was the story of a father's fury, of one man who refused to accept the limits of what was possible, and of how his defiance turned a bomber into a monster that would change the course of the Pacific War. In 1942, the Pacific War was balanced on a knife's edge. Japan's forces stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, moving men and supplies through a network of convoys that seemed unstoppable. Every night, Japanese transports slipped through narrow straits and mist-covered coastlines, delivering reinforcements and ammunition to frontline garrisons. Every morning, American and Australian soldiers died fighting an enemy that never seemed to run out of strength. From the sky, Allied bombers watched helplessly. Their high-altitude attacks scattered bombs across jungles and sea, rarely hitting what mattered. Precision was impossible and bravery wasn't enough. Each failed mission meant more ships arriving safely in Japanese harbors, more guns on the battlefield, more months added to a war that already felt endless. For the men of the 5th Air Force, the problem was brutally simple. No aircraft could hit the enemy where it hurt most. The bombers flew too high. The fighters couldn't carry enough firepower or fuel to reach the convoys. Something had to change, but the Air Force bureaucracy had no answer. The manuals said what could and couldn't be done, and every man who followed those manuals was losing. Pappy Gunn saw it differently. To him, the only real rule was survival. But for Gunn, the stakes were more than strategic. They were deeply personal. His wife Clara and their 4 children were trapped in Manila's Santo Tomas internment camp, prisoners of the same enemy his bombs were meant to destroy. Each day they remained alive was a day of hunger, fear, and cruelty. Each week of delay meant the war dragged on, and their hope grew smaller. Every flight he made, every gun he mounted, was an act of war and love at once. Failure meant not only dead crews and lost battles, it meant his family might never see freedom again. The Allies needed a miracle. Pappy Gunn needed redemption. Between them lay a desperate question. Could one man with scavenged parts and nothing but stubborn determination build a weapon powerful enough to change the course of the Pacific War? The Pacific Theater in 1942 was a nightmare for airmen. The islands of New Guinea and the Solomons were covered in dense jungle, their coastlines sharp with reefs, their skies heavy with unpredictable storms. American and Australian bombers flew from rough airstrips carved into the wilderness, taking off overloaded and exhausted, climbing into a world where the enemy ruled the seas and skies. The standard tactic, bombing from 10,000 or 12,000 feet, was useless here. From that height, even spotting a target through the tropical haze was difficult. Hitting it was nearly impossible. Bombs fell into the jungle, exploding harmlessly among trees. Others splashed into the ocean, sending up empty geysers of water. Japanese ships continued moving through narrow channels, invisible beneath the clouds, their supply lines untouched. The airmen could see the war slipping away, one wasted sortie at a time. The aircraft they had to work with weren't built for this kind of fight. The B-25 Mitchell was a solid machine, twin engines, a 65-foot wingspan, a 6-man crew. It was named for Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, the visionary who once proved that airplanes could sink battleships. Yet by 1942, that vision seemed distant. The B-25 was designed for precision bombing from medium altitudes, not for racing at wave-top height under anti-aircraft fire. It was dependable but conventional, a product of engineers who had never seen the choking jungles or the chaotic island warfare of the Pacific. Its defensive guns were arranged to fend off fighters at altitude. A tail gun, a dorsal turret, a retractable belly gun. Against ships and ground targets, they were almost useless. The B-25 could drop bombs, but it couldn't fight. It could fly, but it couldn't survive down low. Other planes weren't much better. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra could strike low and fast, but they lacked the range to reach distant targets or the firepower to do real damage once they got there. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were designed for long-range, high-altitude missions. They could devastate a city, but they couldn't hit a moving ship hugging a coastline. Light bombers, such as the Douglas A-20 Havoc, had potential, but there simply weren't enough of them to change the outcome of the war. The U.S. Army Air Forces had plenty of airplanes, but none suited to the brutal demands of the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese used their geography like armor. Their ships sailed through narrow seas and shadowed inlets, protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighter cover. Their convoys resupplied remote outposts every night, keeping their soldiers fed and armed. American submarines did what they could, but they couldn't be everywhere. Without an aircraft capable of low-level attack, the Allies were fighting half-blind, watching the enemy reinforce positions faster than they could destroy them. The air crews knew it. The commanders knew it. Even the engineers knew it. But the war machine moved slowly, weighed down by procedure and approval chains that stretched back to Washington. What the 5th Air Force needed wasn't another factory solution, it was a field-born miracle. They needed something that could fly low enough to dodge radar, tough enough to take fire, and deadly enough to wipe out a convoy in minutes. They needed a gunship. But in mid-1942, no such aircraft existed in the American arsenal. It was at this desperate moment that a handful of men began asking the dangerous question that changes everything in war. What if we ignored the rule book? When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Australia in the late summer of 1942, he found an air force on the edge of exhaustion. The men were brave, the planes were plentiful, but the results were dismal. Bombing missions missed their targets, convoys slipped through untouched, and morale sank with every report of another failed strike. Kenney was 53, sharp-minded, and famously impatient with bureaucracy. He had no interest in excuses or reports stamped "not feasible." He wanted results, and he was willing to listen to anyone who could deliver them, regardless of rank, reputation, or regulation. During his inspection tours of forward bases in Queensland, Kenney noticed something unusual at a small, sun-baked airfield near Charters Towers. While other officers spent their days shuffling papers and waiting for spare parts, one man was inside a tin-roofed hangar, tearing apart an aircraft with his bare hands. Grease streaked his uniform. Tools clattered across the floor. He worked with the single-minded focus of someone who didn't care what anyone thought of him. That man was Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn was unlike any officer Kenny had ever met. He wasn't a graduate of West Point or a polished strategist from staff school. He was a sailor turned pilot, a man who had spent 21 years in the U.S. Navy as a mechanic before retiring to the Philippines, where he helped start Philippine Airlines. When the war broke out, he had been flying civilian routes across the islands. Within weeks of Japan's invasion, he was flying daring evacuation missions in unarmed aircraft, smuggling out wounded soldiers, and landing on makeshift strips under fire. He'd been shot down, captured, escaped, and kept flying. And now, in this remote corner of Australia, he was once again doing what came naturally, solving problems with his hands and his instincts. Kenny approached the hangar and asked him what he was doing. Gunn looked up from the nose of a battered Douglas A-20 Havoc and said simply, "Making it bite harder." Where there had once been a bombardier's glass canopy, there was now a solid metal nose packed with 4 .50-caliber Browning machine guns. The guns had been scavenged from wrecked fighters, P-40s and P-39s, that had crash-landed in training accidents. Ammunition belts fed through homemade mounts, welded and bolted together by hand. Gunn explained. His idea: a low-flying, forward-firing bomber that could strafe enemy ships and airfields, suppress anti-aircraft guns, and tear targets apart before dropping bombs. Kenny listened carefully, inspecting the crude modifications. To a factory engineer, the setup would have looked reckless. To Kenny, it looked like genius. Here was a man who understood that war didn't wait for perfect blueprints. Gunn was inventing something the Air Force didn't even know it needed, a hybrid between bomber and fighter, designed for the kind of brutal, close-range combat the Pacific demanded. "Where did you get the guns?" Kenny asked. "Picked them off wrecks," Gunn replied without hesitation. "Figured the planes weren't going anywhere. The guns still worked." Kenny smiled. In that single answer, he recognized the kind of mind that wins wars, the kind that doesn't ask permission, only forgiveness. Within days, Kenny assigned Gunn as his special projects officer and gave him an order as simple as it was impossible. Convert more planes. Make them deadlier. Do it fast. That night, the hangar lights burned long after sunset. Gunn and his small team of mechanics scavenged, welded, and rewired until their hands bled. They weren't following schematics. They were inventing them. They tested alignment by eye, adjusted feed systems by trial and error, and fired short bursts into the scrubland beyond the runway to check for jams. It was crude, dangerous, and completely outside regulations. But it worked. By morning, the first modified A-20s were ready. Gunn climbed into one himself, the old sailor-turned-engineer now acting as his own test pilot. As the engines roared to life, he wasn't thinking about rank or recognition. He was thinking about the Japanese ships that had slipped away, about the soldiers dying for lack of air support, and most of all, about his wife and children trapped in Manila. Every bolt he turned, every gun he mounted, was a step toward them. The official orders called it field modification. Gunn called it survival. The next mission would prove whether his desperate invention could actually change the war or kill the men brave enough to fly it. The dawn of September 12, 1942, broke hot and windless over the New Guinea coast. The air shimmered like glass as a handful of modified Douglas A-20 Havocs sat lined up on the dusty strip at Charters Towers. Their noses, once smooth and glassy, for bombardiers were now armored and bristling with machine guns. They looked awkward, almost brutal, like animals bred for a purpose their designers never imagined. Inside one of them, Pappy Gunn sat at the controls, his fingers wrapped tight around the throttle. This was no test flight on paper. This was war. In a few hours, his idea would face its reckoning over enemy territory. The target was the Japanese airfield at Buna, a base that had been hammering Allied forces for weeks. Every conventional bombing run against it had failed. Anti-aircraft guns surrounded the field, and the jungle canopy hid fuel dumps and parked aircraft from sight. Gunn's plan was radical: attack at treetop height, coming in so low that anti-aircraft gunners would have no time to react. Instead of dropping bombs from thousands of feet, they would strafe the target first, then release parafrag bombs, small, explosive charges slowed by parachutes so the planes wouldn't be caught in their own blasts. As the A-20s lifted off, the pilots felt the weight of the extra guns, ammunition, and armor. The planes handled differently, heavier on the nose, sluggish in the climb, but they flew true. Hours later, over the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the formation dropped down to less than 100 feet, skimming over palm trees and rivers, the roar of engines echoing off the terrain. Ahead lay Buna. Japanese spotters barely had time to sound the alarm before the first A-20s thundered over the airfield, guns blazing. The effect was devastating. Streams of .50 caliber rounds tore through parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and barracks. The parafrag bombs followed, tumbling from low altitude, their parachutes snapping open before detonating just above the ground. Fire blossomed across the airfield, fuel storage tanks erupted in black columns of smoke, aircraft burned where they sat, and ammunition dumps exploded in a chain reaction that shook the jungle. By the time the defenders returned fire, the A-20s were already gone, racing back over the treetops, the smell of smoke still clinging to their wings. When the formation returned to base, the air crews were silent at first, half in disbelief. They had just flown one of the most daring low-level raids of the war and survived. The reports that followed were almost impossible to believe. The Japanese airfield had been effectively wiped out, with minimal Allied losses. The crude modifications, guns, scavenged from wrecks, welded mounts, and hand-built feed systems had turned an ordinary bomber into a deadly weapon. For General Kenny, it was proof that improvisation could succeed where doctrine had failed. For Gunn, it was something else entirely. His creation had worked not just on paper, but in blood and fire. The old mechanic had built something that could finally strike back, something the Japanese had no defense against. The news of the raid spread quickly through the 5th Air Force, whispered from pilot to pilot, "Pappy's planes work." That success changed everything. The A-20 conversions became the foundation for a new kind of warfare, fast, low, and merciless. And yet, even as others celebrated, Gunn was already thinking ahead. The A-20 was only a beginning. He knew the real answer lay in something larger, stronger, and more versatile. If a light bomber could become a gunship, what could a medium bomber do? As he stood on the tarmac, watching the black smoke rise over the horizon where Buna once stood, Gunn's mind was already moving. The next step would be harder. He would have to rebuild the B-25 Mitchell itself, to tear apart one of America's most respected bombers and reforge it into something entirely new. It was a risk few men would take, but Gunn wasn't thinking about risk anymore. He was thinking about how to make the next one bite even harder. Turning a handful of successful A-20 strafers into a reliable force of B-25 gunships was not a quick hack. It was a brutal, iterative engineering program driven by urgency, intuition, and an almost manic work ethic. The B-25. Mitchell was a fundamentally different machine from the light A-20. Where the A-20 was small and relatively nimble, the B-25 was heavier, larger, and designed around an entirely different mission profile. Medium-altitude level bombing. That design brought its own problems, when you tried to cram heavy Browning 50 caliber machine guns into the nose and fuselage. Adding dozens of heavy guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. Recoil forces from simultaneous bursts created stresses on the airframe that no one at the factory had anticipated for a medium bomber. And the extra weight changed handling characteristics, takeoff runs, climb rates, and the way the bomber reacted. At low altitude, none of those problems were theoretical. They were the difference between an aircraft that could return its crew home and one that would cartwheel into the sea when a wing stalled or a pilot misjudged speed. Gunn tackled each issue the way he always had, with his hands. Working out of a cramped conversion center in Townsville and later at other depots, he and a small team of mechanics, scavengers, fabricators, and pilots pressed into makeshift engineering roles, began a sustained program of modification. The transparent bombardier's nose was removed and replaced with solid metal panels. In that newly armored nose, the team mounted arrays of Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, initially 8 forward-firing weapons, later increased on some aircraft with additional cheek-mounted guns in the fuselage and underwing packages. Mounts were welded and riveted to existing structure, reinforced where necessary with steel plates welded into the airframe. Ammunition boxes and feed chutes were routed through newly formed compartments and tested repeatedly for jams and feed failures. A single stoppage in a burst could mean the difference between suppression of enemy fire and a doomed bombing run. Every rivet, every weld, was a small gamble against structural fatigue and the violent forces of sustained automatic fire. Recoil was its own nightmare. A 50 caliber Browning firing armor-piercing rounds produces a substantial impulse, and when several such guns fired together, the cumulative recoil could be felt throughout the aircraft. Pilots reported the Mitchell shuddering when the forward guns opened up, the nose dipping perceptibly and trim changing in the blink of an eye. Guns crews learned to distribute fire and angle attacks to compensate. Bursts were timed, gunners coordinated, and pilots adjusted trim for known recoil patterns. Structural reinforcements and careful alignment of the weapon mounts reduced torsional stress. But the modifications always involved trade-offs. More firepower meant heavier nose weight, which required changes to bomb loads, fuel distribution, and sometimes even the way the aircraft took off from short jungle airstrips. The conversions demanded new checklists, new emergency procedures, and an acceptance that the strafer would never handle like a factory-fresh Mitchell. Material shortages and supply constraints forced improvisation at every turn. There were never enough brand-new guns or perfect mountings available. Much of the early equipment came from wrecked fighters, obsolete spares, and whatever armor plate the depots could scrounge. Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative on site, became an indispensable bridge between field improvisation and factory knowledge. Fox sent back sketches and reports to Long Beach. Engineers there followed Gunn's field results with a mixture of alarm and fascination. Formal approvals took months, time the theater could not spare, so Gunn's crews developed, tested, and refined conversion kits in far less refined conditions. They trialed different gun combinations, experimented with cheek and blister mounts, and tested new ammunition storage schemes to maximize rounds on board while keeping weight manageable. Ammunition consumption was enormous. Strafing runs burned thousands of rounds in seconds, and the logistics of resupply, bringing belts of 50s to forward bases, became a grinding part of the program. Pilots and crews had to relearn how to fly a Mitchell. Where conventional B-25 doctrine emphasized formation flying, medium-altitude bombing runs, and coordinated level releases, the Strafer required low-altitude aggression, split-second timing, and a tolerance for risk that bordered on recklessness. Flight tactics were rewritten in the field. Attack profiles specified wave-top approach heights, coordinated suppressive fire from multiple aircraft to overwhelm anti-aircraft crews, and synchronizing skip bombing runs so that the strafers suppressed gunners during the brief window the bombers needed to release their loads. Gunn himself flew many of these tests, not as a distant supervisor but in the cockpit, refining sighting methods, testing how the Mitchell reacted under full forward armament, and learning when an aircraft was too nose-heavy to safely perform the pull-up after a low run. He was wounded multiple times in combat engagements during this period. The list of decorations he accumulated, Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Silver Star, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts, was a direct reflection of how personally he had thrown himself into the experiment. As the conversion program matured, the crude field modifications became standardized into repeatable kits. Maintenance crews developed checklists for the new fuel and weight distributions. Gunners developed tactics for optimal burst lengths to conserve ammunition and reduce wear. And supply officers created streamlined processes to feed belts and spare parts to forward bases. The B-25's capacity to carry both substantial bomb loads and a dense forward battery of machine guns made it uniquely versatile. Some aircraft were fitted with additional underwing blisters or fuselage packages to mount 2 or 4 more guns, bringing forward-firing totals into double digits on some conversions. Parachute fragmentation bombs, a tactical innovation in themselves, were added to the mix, allowing aircraft to float small charges over airfields and installations to create maximum personnel and material casualties without risking the attacking aircraft in their own blasts. None of this was elegant. It was rough, often dangerous, and always intensely practical. Gunn's conversions had to pass the stern test of combat, and they did, first in small raids, then in larger coordinated operations that would culminate in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The conversion program was not a single dramatic night of welding. It was weeks and months of sweat, of trial and error, of pilots learning to manage recoil and nose weight, of armament technicians fabricating reliable feeds out of imperfect parts. But the result was undeniable. A medium bomber reimagined as a close support, ship-killing platform fast enough to survive in contested skies, heavy enough to carry meaningful ordnance, and armed with a forward-firing concentration of firepower that forced the enemy to rethink the safety of their convoys. What began as fieldwork in a tin hangar had become a replicable model that would be copied, formalized, and eventually incorporated into production designs, proof that necessity, skill, and relentless refinement could convert desperation into doctrine. March 1943 began with a problem that could not be tolerated. A Japanese convoy steaming through the Solomon Sea, carrying reinforcements and supplies enough to blunt Allied advances and potentially change the ground campaign in New Guinea. Intelligence reports pinned down the convoy's departure point, its escort strength, and its destination. What the Allies had to do was simple in statement and fiendish in execution: destroy every transport, sink the escorts if possible, and deny the enemy the men and materiel they had so carefully loaded. Failure would leave Japanese forces resupplied, emboldened, and able to resist Allied pushes for months. Success would be decisive. The plan that emerged combined audacity and improvisation. A coordinated assault using every tool available, high-altitude bombers to harass and slow the convoy, fighters to suppress enemy defense when possible, skip-bombing Mitchells to deliver crippling hits below the waterline. And ahead of them all, the strafers that Pappy Gunn and his teams had forged to neutralize anti-aircraft defenses long enough for the bombers to do their work. The operation opened in miserable weather, which paradoxically favored the attackers. Thick cloud banks and squalls hid approach routes and masked formations until the last moment. On March the 2nd and into the 3rd, reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy, keeping Allied command updated as escort destroyers shepherded the transports along. The initial high-altitude attacks from B-17s and other conventional units did what they could. They forced the convoy to maneuver, disrupted tight formations, and contributed to a state of constant alarm among the Japanese crews. But those strikes alone were insufficient. The transports were largely unharmed, and the destroyers, fast, heavily armed, and viciously defended, presented a lethal problem for any aircraft attempting to deliver bombs from medium altitude. What changed the equation was the integration of Gunn's Strafer B-25s into a carefully sequenced plan. The Mitchells, converted into Strafers, were assigned the most dangerous job: to fly in low, to suppress and shred the anti-aircraft teams aboard the ships, and to create a brief, lethal window for the skip bombers to deliver their special 500-pound bombs that would bounce into the hulls. Coordinating all of this required timing so precise it bordered on choreography. The Strafers would arrive first, hugging wave tops at speeds that barely allowed human reaction times. When they opened up, swaths of 50-caliber projectiles would cut the decks and superstructures to pieces. With gunners suppressed or killed, the skip bombers would skim in and release their loads at point-blank range. The bombs would skip across the surface and slam into the hulls below the waterline, where even a single well-placed explosion could doom a transport. The assault unfolded in a 3-day nightmare for the Japanese. At first, the Strafers came in like thunder, their forward batteries erupting in concentrated bursts. Live sustained fire from as many as 14 50-caliber machine guns on some Mitchells created a kind of rolling metal curtain. Gun crews on the ships were cut down before they could respond effectively. The rate and density of that fire were unlike anything the defenders had trained for. Superstructures that had once served as command posts and gun platforms became Swiss-cheesed ruins. Bridges and chart rooms were perforated. Radios and rangefinders were smashed, and the organized chaos of damage control began to wither under the weight of sheer kinetic violence. Within that chaos, the skip bombers executed their runs. Pilots came in at almost impossible angles and heights, often as low as 50 feet, releasing bombs with a practiced flick that sent the explosives skittering like flat stones toward waiting steel. When a bomb struck hull plating near or below the waterline, the result was catastrophic. Seams opened, compartments flooded, fires raced, and transport ships that carried thousands of troops and tons of supplies began to founder quickly. A transport, half-loaded and adrift, was hopeless against a well-placed bomb, and the subsequent strafing that targeted any attempt at lifeboat deployment or rescue. Destroyers that tried to come to the aid of stricken transports found themselves in the same hell, exposed, riddled with holes, and in several cases, literally broken in half by the concussions and shrapnel of near misses and direct strikes. The carnage was total in a way that stunned both sides. By the time the fighting subsided, 8 transports and 4 destroyers had been sunk or rendered unsalvageable. The number of Japanese troops lost, whether to the initial blasts, the sinking, or the sea, was enormous. Thousands perished, and only a fraction of the embarked forces managed to reach land. Allied losses were comparatively light in men and materiel. A handful of aircraft shot down and crews lost, but no loss that approached the scale of the destruction wrought upon the convoy. The ratio of enemy shipping and personnel destroyed to Allied cost was catastrophic for the Japanese and decisive for the Allies. It was the kind of result that, in the calculus of war, could not be overstated. A resupply mission intended to reinforce and resuscitate a threatened theater had been annihilated before it could even reach shore. The immediate operational effects rippled outward. The Japanese, shaken by the ferocity and effectiveness of the attack, were forced to reconsider daylight convoy operations in contested waters. Supply runs became more cautious, often relegated to night, and dispersed routing that reduced efficiency and delayed reinforcements. On the ground, isolated garrisons that might have been reinforced were left to wither. The failure of the convoy to deliver men and material had tangible consequences in ensuing battles and territorial gains. For Allied commanders, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea provided hard proof that a new kind of aerial warfare, one built on suppression by concentrated automatic fire, low-level precision, and coordinated skip bombing, could break the logistical backbone of an enemy empire. The human cost was wrenching. Sailors and soldiers who had expected to land and fight never reached the beaches. Sailors on escort ships faced death in the smoke and burning wreckage of their own vessels. Air crews who had volunteered for the strangest and most dangerous of missions bore witness to scenes that would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. For Pappy Gunn, the victory was bittersweet. Every Japanese transport sunk, and every convoy disrupted was a step closer to relieving Allied pressure on the ground, and, more intimately, a measure, however small, toward the ultimate goal of shortening the war and hastening the liberation of occupied territories, including the internment camp where his family languished. Strategically, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed perceptions as much as it changed the maps. It proved that field-driven innovation, when married to tactical daring and careful coordination, could overcome the supposed limits of existing platforms. It also forced institutional change. Conversion programs accelerated, depot modifications were formalized, and the lessons learned during those frantic days were written into doctrine, influencing aircraft design and tactics long after the smoke cleared. The one, and how it had been won, sent a clear message through the theater and back to Washington. Desperate times demanded desperate measures, and when those measures worked, they could do more than salvage the immediate battle. They could redefine how air power was used for years to come. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't just prove the worth of Pappy Gunn's improvisations, it forced the U.S. Army Air Forces and its industrial partners to rethink how aircraft were built and used. Reports of the victory swept through the Pacific Command and quickly reached the desks of engineers and planners back in the United States. What Gunn and his small team had accomplished in makeshift hangars with scavenged parts was now being studied by design bureaus that had once dismissed such field modifications as reckless. The results were undeniable. The gunship concept worked. It made the enemy's supply routes untenable and transformed the medium bomber into something far more flexible and lethal. At North American Aviation's plant in California, engineers began to receive sketches, measurements, and after-action reports from the Southwest Pacific. Technical representatives like Jack Fox relayed Gunn's modifications in detail, where the guns had been placed, how the mounts absorbed recoil, and what structural reinforcements were necessary to keep the aircraft stable. Within months, the E.B. Padu company began experimenting with integrating Gunn's ideas into official production lines. The first result was the B-25G, introduced in late 1943. It replaced the transparent bombardier's nose with a solid metal one housing a massive 75mm M4 cannon, a tank gun, adapted for air use, supplemented by 4 50-caliber machine guns. The logic seemed sound. If a few machine guns worked, perhaps a cannon could do even better. In practice, the weapon proved too unwieldy. The recoil was punishing, each shot shaking the entire aircraft and throwing off aim. The gun required manual reloading between shots, limiting its usefulness during fast, low-level attacks. Crews discovered that the simpler, more reliable streams of 50-caliber fire were far deadlier than a handful of cannon shells. The next evolution, the B-25H, refined Gunn's principle instead of reinventing it. The heavy cannon remained for some models, but engineers emphasized what Gunn had already proven: volume of fire. The H model carried up to 14 50-caliber machine guns, 8 concentrated in the nose, with additional guns in cheek blisters and underwing pods. Some configurations could unleash more than 13,000 rounds per minute, creating a sustained wall of metal that tore through ships, airfields, and convoys alike. The B-25J, introduced in 1944, perfected the concept, a modular design that allowed for both conventional bombing noses and the now famous strafer nose. When configured as a strafer, the J carried 18 machine guns, 14 firing forward. It was the industrial codification of Gunn's battlefield creativity, a factory-built monster inspired by one man's desperation and ingenuity. The adoption of these designs institutionalized a new doctrine: firepower over formality, simplicity over sophistication. The lessons from New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea became training material for new crews. Tactics manuals were rewritten to include low-level attack profiles and coordinated skip bombing techniques. Even Allied air forces outside the U.S. took notice. The British, Australians, and Dutch requested similar conversions, while depot engineers across the Pacific replicated Gunn's methods using their own resources. Factories back home could now produce aircraft that already included the features once built in tin sheds and dirt airstrips. For the Japanese, the effect was catastrophic. Convoys that had once sailed with confidence were now easy prey. The sight of approaching Mitchells, their noses blackened with gun barrels, became synonymous with destruction. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to mount a defense. By the time they spotted the attackers, walls of tracer fire already raked their decks. The concentrated forward battery of the new B-25s didn't just damage ships, it annihilated morale. Enemy documents captured later in the war warned units not to engage Allied strafers at all, describing them as invulnerable and unstoppable. What had begun as one man's unorthodox experiment now dictated how an empire moved its fleets. In military circles, this evolution marked the formal birth of the gunship concept. It proved that an aircraft could be more than a delivery platform for bombs. It could itself be a sustained fire weapon. Gunn's philosophy, distilled through production models and field experience, bridged the gap between traditional bombers and the modern close air support aircraft that would dominate later conflicts. The conversion of the B-25 from a medium bomber into a low-level attack platform reshaped aerial strategy across the Pacific, setting a precedent that innovation could begin at the edge of the battlefield and then ripple backward into factories and doctrine. By the end of 1943, the United States was producing hundreds of these new gun-laden B-25s every month. Each carried the DNA of Gunn's first crude prototypes: solid noses, massed machine guns, and the will to fly low, strike fast, and overwhelm the enemy with firepower. What had started as a desperate improvisation had become official policy. Its success measured not only in battles won, but in the new confidence of Allied airmen who finally possessed the tools they needed to dominate the skies. By the spring of 1944, the transformation that had begun in Pappy Gunn's dusty hangar was complete. His field improvisations had become factory doctrine. His ideas had reshaped combat tactics, and his name, once whispered among mechanics as the eccentric who bolted guns to anything that flew, was now known throughout the Pacific. The B-25 had evolved from a conventional bomber into one of the most feared strike aircraft in history, and at the center of that revolution was a man who had started his war not as a general or an engineer, but as a father trying to fight his way back to his family. Gunn's official recognition came slowly, but inevitably. His relentless pace of work and willingness to ignore rank had earned him both admiration and exasperation from superiors. Eventually, his accomplishments were too visible to overlook. He was promoted, sent back to the United States, and tasked with overseeing production at North American Aviation. It was, in effect, the Army Air Forces admitting that a self-taught, Tinkerer in the field had accomplished what their formal development programs could not. Yet Gunn was restless. He was no bureaucrat, and factory floors could never replace the smell of oil, cordite, and danger. He wanted to fly, to fight, to keep shaping his machines where they mattered most, in combat. Against advice, he returned to the Pacific later that same year. His presence on the front lines symbolized the bridge between innovation and action. The man who built the tools still trusted himself to wield them. He continued to fly missions, often personally testing new armament configurations or attack tactics, until an air raid in late 1944 left him badly wounded. It was his 9th combat injury, 9 Purple Hearts worth of proof that his ideas were tested not in laboratories, but under fire. The wound finally grounded him. By then, the weapon he had conceived, the forward-firing gunship bomber, was so thoroughly embedded in Allied strategy that his personal absence could not halt its momentum. In February 1945, the war came full circle for Pappy Gunn. American forces liberated Manila after weeks of savage fighting, and among the thousands freed from the Santo Tomas internment camp were his wife Clara and their 4 children. For 3 years they had endured starvation, disease, and cruelty, never knowing whether he was alive. Their reunion was almost too much to comprehend. The man who had built his own war to save them now stood in front of them, thin, scarred, and worn, but alive. For Gunn, every sleepless night, every modification, every sortie had been for this moment. He had set out to shorten the war, and in some small, brutal, undeniable way. He had, after Japan's surrender in August 1945, Gunn stayed in uniform a few more years, helping to formalize the tactics and technical programs that had sprung from his innovations. When he finally retired in 1948, it was with the rank of colonel, medically discharged from accumulated wounds. But retirement did not mean stillness. He returned to the Philippines, the country where he had built both his family and his legend, and poured his energy into rebuilding Philippine Airlines, the company he had helped found before the war. The same practical brilliance that had turned bombers into monsters now helped rebuild a nation's first post-war airline. He flew again, not in combat, but in commerce, carrying passengers instead of bombs, helping reconnect islands that war had severed. Yet the skies that had defined his life would also claim it. On October 11, 1957, while flying a chartered Beech 18 through a tropical storm, Colonel Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn's plane went down over the Philippines. He was 57 years old. After surviving 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of constant war, 9 wounds, and countless near misses, it was a peacetime storm, not battle, that finally ended his journey. He left behind a wife, children, and a legacy so vast that even decades later, his name would surface in every serious history of aerial warfare. That legacy was not just mechanical, but doctrinal. The concept of the heavily armed gunship did not die with him. It evolved. In the Korean War, modified B-25s equipped with gun-inspired forward armaments provided close air support over the Korean peninsula. In Vietnam, the United States resurrected his ideas in the form of side-firing AC-47, spooky gunships, cargo planes fitted with miniguns, and cannons for sustained low-altitude fire. The later AC-130 Spectre refined the model even further, carrying 20mm Vulcans, 40mm Bofors cannons, and even 105mm howitzers, all dedicated to delivering overwhelming, precise firepower from the air. Every one of these aircraft traced its lineage back to the workshop of a man who had learned, under duress, that sometimes the best weapon was not the newest or the most sophisticated, but the one built by necessity and sheer will. Gunn's influence extended beyond the machines themselves. He had proven that innovation did not have to start in laboratories or boardrooms. It could come from men who worked with their hands, from soldiers who refused to accept defeat, from leaders who saw problems not as dead ends, but as challenges to be solved. His work redefined how the military thought about creativity in wartime. Improvisation defeating engineering, one officer later called it, a phrase that might as well have been his epitaph. By the time of his death, the air forces of the world had accepted what Pappy Gunn had understood instinctively, that air power was not about altitude or elegance, but about delivering fire where it mattered most. His aircraft, those crude, vicious B-25 strafers, had changed the rhythm of the Pacific War. They had made daylight convoys suicidal, devastated airfields, and turned the skies over the islands into a killing ground for the enemy. They had, in the simplest and most direct sense, shortened the war. And behind them all stood one man who could never sit still, who would rather work through the night with a wrench and a torch than wait for permission. Today, his name lives on not just in museums or military textbooks, but in the design lineage of every modern gunship that circles above a battlefield. Whether it is an AC-130 providing cover in the 21st century or a low-flying attack aircraft strafing enemy lines, the philosophy remains the same. The weapon that wins is the one you build when you can't afford to wait. Pappy Gunn built his in a tin shed under pressure, with limited tools and limitless determination. His machines fought for victory. His will fought for family. Both succeeded. The story of Pappy Gunn is more than a chronicle of machines and battles. It is a testament to the raw human forces that drive innovation when logic, rules, and reason all say no. His life embodies one of war's deepest truths, that necessity may inspire invention, but desperation gives it power. The world remembers him for the gunship, for the B-25's transformation from a polite medium bomber into a snarling weapon of destruction. But the true legacy he left behind was philosophical. Gunn showed that progress in war or in any human endeavor often comes not from the laboratories of the safe and the certain, but from the hands of those who refuse to accept limits. There is irony in the legacy he built. The B-25 Mitchell was designed for stability and altitude, to deliver its payload from a place of safety. It was a weapon of precision, engineered to strike from distance. But Gunn turned that philosophy upside down. He made the bomber descend, scrape the sea, and confront its enemy head-on. In doing so, he changed not just what the airplane could do, but what air power itself meant. He proved that the purpose of a weapon is not defined by its manual, but by the imagination of the person who wields it. Orthodoxy said the Mitchell was a medium bomber. Desperation said it was a gunship waiting to be discovered. His approach was brutally simple. Where others saw design flaws, he saw opportunities. Where bureaucrats demanded plans and permissions, he reached for a wrench. When they said the guns would unbalance the aircraft, he welded them on anyway. His methods were rough, even reckless, but they worked. And in their success lay a broader lesson. Progress often begins with the person who asks the forbidden question, what if we did it differently? In every generation since, the spirit of Gunn's defiance has echoed through the corridors of engineering, the cockpits of aircraft, and the minds of those who fight impossible odds. The gunships of later wars, the AC-47, Spooky, the AC-130, Spectre, the AC-130J, Ghost Rider, all trace their lineage not just through hardware, but through attitude. They are built on the same principle Gunn discovered in the crucible of necessity. Take what you have and make it do what it must. Each one of those aircraft carries his DNA, not in blueprints, but in philosophy. There is a poetic symmetry to his legacy. A man who began life as a blacksmith's son ended up forging weapons that reshaped aerial warfare. A father whose family was trapped in captivity gave the Allied air forces the means to liberate a continent. His fury became a doctrine. His improvisation became industry standard. And his name, once known only to a handful of mechanics sweating under a tin roof in Queensland, became immortalized in every burst of gunfire that saved soldiers' lives on the ground below. The lessons of Pappy Gunn's life reach beyond the battlefield. They speak to the power of ingenuity under pressure, the strength of conviction in the face of failure, and the belief that even one person, armed with purpose and defiance, can change the course of history. In every field where innovation is stifled by caution or fear, his story offers a reminder: perfection is a luxury, but determination is survival. So when we look at the shining aluminum of those B-25s, their noses dark with machine guns and their engines roaring over the sea, we see more than an aircraft. We see the proof of a principle that greatness is often built not in laboratories or offices, but in the sweat and grit of those who refuse to wait for permission. Pappy Gunn's lesson endures. When the manual says it can't be done, do it anyway, and make it work. The Pacific sun rose on the final months of the war, and with it came the quiet recognition of what men like Pappy Gunn had achieved. The great battles were over, the empires undone, and the machines that had carried the fight stood silent on runways that only months before had been alive with thunder. Among them sat the B-25 Mitchells, some scorched and patched, others gleaming under new paint, but all bearing the same scars of the mission they had been born into. They were no longer just bombers. They were symbols of what could happen when a single man refused to accept that the ordinary was enough. Pappy Gunn's story ends where it began, in the sweat, the fire, and the will of one man to build something that mattered. What began as desperation to reach his captive family became one of the most important transformations in the history of aerial warfare. His makeshift gunships changed not only the course of the Pacific War, but also the course of military thinking itself. The idea that a single aircraft could project concentrated, sustained firepower reshaped how wars were fought from the air for generations to come. In every sense, the world we live in today still flies in the shadow of Pappy Gunn's imagination. But behind the roaring engines and thundering guns lay something quieter and more human. He didn't invent for glory, or for medals, or for a place in textbooks. He invented because he couldn't stand still while others suffered. Every plate of armor he welded, every gun he mounted, every sortie he flew came from a single thought: that the war had to end sooner because his family was waiting. That personal, relentless urgency gave his work a soul that no blueprint ever could. The irony remains striking. The B-25 Mitchell, designed to bomb from altitude, ended up becoming the deadliest low-level attacker of its age. A weapon meant for precision from afar became a monster of close destruction. And the man who made it so wasn't a general or a designer, but a mechanic with grease on his hands and fury in his heart. Orthodoxy said it couldn't be done. Gunn proved that orthodoxy doesn't win wars, imagination does. Today, every time a gunship circles a battlefield, tracing its long, slow arcs in the sky, it carries with it the echo of Pappy Gunn's defiance. Every burst of tracer fire that rips through the night is part of a legacy forged in that Queensland hangar more than 80 years ago. The weapons may be newer, the electronics smarter, but the spirit remains unchanged. Take what you have, make it stronger, make it faster, make it mean something. The next time you see footage of a modern gunship firing from the clouds, precise, devastating, unstoppable, remember that it all began with one man and a question that should never have worked. What if we added more guns? That question, simple and audacious, carried the weight of a family's hope, an army's survival, and a war's turning point. It transformed a bomber into a monster, a mechanic into a legend, and desperation into one of the most enduring lessons in history. Thank you for watching. For more stories of forgotten ingenuity and human courage, make sure to subscribe. And remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world isn't the machine itself, but the will of the person who dares to build it.